The parable of the sower is one of the best known parables of Jesus. And we know what it means as well, because Jesus explains it himself. And it's about the four different ways, or about four different ways that people respond to the message of Jesus. You know, some people reject the message out of hand. That's the seed that falls on the path. Other people think the message of Jesus is fantastic until it isn't. And that's the seed that falls on rocky ground. And other people think the message of Jesus is great, but it turns out that it can't compete with all the other things in their lives. And that's the seed that fell among the thorns. And the fourth group of people think that the message of Jesus is fantastic, and they give it everything it needs so that it grows and bears fruit in their lives. And that's the seed that fell in the good soil. Now, I'd say that pretty much all of us here today haven't rejected the message of Jesus, and so we're not like the seed that fell on the path that got eaten by the birds. Most of us would like to think that we're like the good soil where the seeds grow up and produce a crop. But if we're honest, a lot of the time our faith looks more like the second and third examples in the parable, the seed that falls on the rocky ground or the seed that falls into the thorns. And Jesus explains to his disciples what these two examples mean. The first one, the seed that falls on rocky ground, is like people who accept the word, but there's no depth to sustain their faith. And the seed that falls amongst thorns is like people who accept the word, and they might have enough depth, but the rest of their life has more depth, and their faith doesn't end up producing anything. Now, at the beginning of chapter 13, it says, that same day. In other words, chapter 12 happened in the morning, and chapter 13, where Jesus goes out and tells parables, happens in the afternoon. And we might say, well, does it really matter? It all happened 2,000 years ago. So, what's the matter about one day or the other? The reason it matters is because this parable in chapter 13 is actually Jesus' commentary on some of the episodes that have happened earlier that day in chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 22 to 32, the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. And they're so determined to reject Jesus that they accuse him of channeling Satan. In fact, their hearts are so hardened that they end up contradicting themselves. They aren't even logically consistent about their own ideas of what it means to fight evil, as Jesus points out. And the Pharisees are like the seed that fell on the path. Their hearts are so hardened against the good news that Jesus is proclaiming that it just bounces off them, and Satan takes it away. And some of us will know people like that, people who are absolutely determined not to believe. No matter what you say about Jesus, it just bounces off them. They'll often use arguments that they've practiced over and over, or they've read on the internet or whatever, and they're like a well-trodden track. They're like the seed that fell on the path. Then in Matthew 12, verses 43 to 45, Jesus describes what happens after an exorcism. And he says the evil spirit goes away, but then it returns and brings several others as well. And bear in mind, Jesus had just done an exorcism earlier in the chapter. A man who'd been possessed by a demon so that he was blind and mute had been healed. Now, these days we can be a bit uncomfortable talking about demons, so we can be inclined to explain it away. But whatever had actually happened, that man had had an incredible experience. He'd been blind and unable to speak, and suddenly everything had changed for the better. It would be an experience that man would never forget. But that's Jesus' warning. If you're relying on that one experience, then you're like an empty house. If you're not going to learn from that experience and grow from that experience, if you're not going to put down roots, then you won't have any depth. If you don't keep listening to the good news, then your faith won't last and you'll end up worse than before. And notice how Jesus starts the parable in chapter 13. He says, listen, a sower went out to sow. And then at the end of the parable, he says, let anyone with ears to hear listen. What Jesus is saying is that you can't rely on an experience no matter how powerful it is. We need to grow. We need to put down roots. We need to keep listening to Jesus and reading our Bibles. If we don't, we'll end up like the seed that fell on rocky ground, and not only will our faith not produce anything, we'll end up worse than when we started. And so in Matthew chapter 12, verses 22 to 32, the Pharisees reject Jesus. They're like the seed that fell on the hardened path. And then in verses 43 to 45, Jesus warns that you can't rely on an experience, no matter how powerful it might have been. If you do, you're like the seed that fell on the rocky ground, which springs up quickly, but then soon dies. And then at the end of chapter 12, Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 to 50, Jesus' family turns up. And this is about the seed that fell among the thorns. It's true, isn't it? Our families can be the thing that pulls us away from Jesus, that choke our faith. It's not that families are evil. Families are a good thing. I've got a wonderful family and I'm really grateful for them. But because families are a good thing, they can end up having more power over us than Jesus does. And notice how Jesus' family behaves. They don't come inside to where Jesus is. They expect Jesus to come out to them. And there's an incredibly strong sense of entitlement there, isn't there? But Jesus responds with some very powerful words. He redefines his family. His true family is whoever does the will of my Father in heaven. Jesus had already said what it meant to do the will of his Father in heaven. It meant to believe in the good news of the kingdom. And that meant to follow the Son, the Son of God, that's Jesus. And the disciples were already following Jesus, and that's why he points to them when he redefines his family. But even the disciples didn't fully understand, and that's why after Jesus had told this parable of the sower, they came and asked Jesus why. And Jesus replies with these words, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." These are confronting words. But what Jesus is saying is that if you reject Jesus, or if you rely on experience, or if you let other things choke the good news, then your faith won't produce any fruit. But not only that, you won't even understand what Jesus is saying. And that's why Jesus quotes these words from Isaiah. You will indeed listen, but never understand. You will indeed look, but never perceive. These are very harsh words, and Jesus is applying them to the Pharisees who had rejected him. He was also applying them to anyone who relied on a past experience and refuses to put down roots and grow. And Jesus was also applying these words to his own family, his mother and his brothers. You will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. See, this whole episode has been about listening. The Pharisees wouldn't listen to Jesus. They were like the hardened path. People who have an amazing experience, they often think they don't need to listen to Jesus. They're like the rocky ground. And families can make us think that they're more important than listening to Jesus. They're like the thorns that choke the seed so that it never matures. And so Jesus starts this parable by saying, listen. And then he finishes the parable with these words, let anyone with ears to hear listen. But Jesus has some very different words for the disciples, the ones who had already given up everything to follow Jesus. Here's what he told them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. And as he starts to explain the parable to his disciples, Matthew 13, verse 18, Jesus says these words, hear then the parable of the sower. Amen.